actually been quite proactive with his advice. For example, after rumours of an agreement between Tony Blair and George Bush in early 2002, Lord Goldsmith says he took it upon himself to write to the Prime Minister to tell him that military action would be dependent on a UN resolution.
I didn't want there to be any doubt that, in my view, the Prime Minister could not have the view that he could agree with President Bush somehow, well, let's go without going back to the United Nations. I wasn't asked for it. I don't frankly think it was terribly welcome.
Straightforward enough, but Britain and America did get a UN resolution, 1441, passed in November 2002, and here is where the difficulty starts. This gave Iraq one last chance to comply. If it didn't, it would be deemed to be in material breach of previous UN resolutions authorising war. The problem is, who should decide whether there was a material breach? The resolution appears unclear. At first, Lord Goldsmith agreed with the Foreign Office legal team that a further decision by the UN Security Council was needed to authorise military action.
As I think the tribunal, probably the world knows, at one stage, my provisional view was that taking all these factors into the balance, there wasn't enough there. The balance came down in favour of saying no, a second resolution is needed. Subsequently, no doubt we'll come on to it, for good reasons which I will seek to explain to the tribunal. I then ultimately reached, when I had to reach a definitive view on this, a different view.
But it was slow going getting to that different view after Resolution 1441 was passed. On the 11th of November, Lord Goldsmith had a phone call with Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's Chief of Staff. He told Mr. Powell he was pessimistic that the UN resolution allowed for military action on its own. The next day, there was a phone call with the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw. He told Mr. Straw that a further UN decision was needed. In December, Lord Goldsmith was asked for draft advice by the Prime Minister. He supplied this on the 14th of January. He still thought that the UN had to decide whether or not there'd been a material breach which would authorise military action. He wasn't dissuaded from this view after the 23rd of January, when he had a meeting with Sir Jeremy Greenstock, Britain's man at the UN during the negotiations of 1441. Nor was he persuaded by a letter from Jack Straw on the 6th of February, in which Mr. Straw described Lord Goldsmith's view as ignoring both the negotiating history and the wording of Resolution 1441. The clincher, though, for Lord Goldsmith in changing his mind was a trip on the 10th of February to Washington. Senior American lawyers, diplomats and officials in Washington, including Condoleezza Rice, briefed the Attorney General about their negotiating position on Resolution 1441. They convinced Lord Goldsmith that their only priority had been not to hand to the UN Security Council a veto on the US taking military action, which they already believed they were entitled to do.
And it was, frankly, quite hard to believe, given what I'd been told about the one red line that President Bush had, that all these experienced lawyers and negotiators in the United States could actually have stumbled into doing the one thing that they've been told mustn't happen.
Lord Goldsmith finally submitted his formal legal advice on the 7th of March 2003. He said there was a reasonable case for going to war without a second resolution, but that a second resolution would be the safest course of action. However, after a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Chief of the Defence Staff on the 11th of March, he was persuaded to firm up this view. And by the 13th of March, he decided that 1441 alone was sufficient. That is, Britain could go to war legally without another UN resolution.
Our troops deserved more. Our civil servants who might be on the line deserved more than my saying there was a reasonable case, and therefore it was important for me to come down clearly on one side of the argument or the other, which is what I proceeded to do.
One of the few times this very experienced lawyer looked somewhat uncomfortable was when he was reminded of a meeting that he'd had with Jack Straw on the 13th of March 2003. The official minute of which records Lord Goldsmith telling Jack Straw that he might need to appraise the Cabinet of the fact that the legal issues were, quote, finally balanced. Jack Straw persuaded the Attorney General not to, in case that view was leaked.
Lord Goldsmith emphatically denied he'd changed his view because he'd been leaned on.
Whether or not the military intervention was, as a matter of policy, right or wrong, I don't think is for me to judge. But so far as the legality is concerned, I did reach the view then, and still am of the opinion that it was lawful. I stand by that advice.
One frustration today, some of the key documents haven't yet been declassified by the government. Despite that, how did Lord Goldsmith get on?
He had a hard case to argue, because it's hard to argue why you changed your mind when there weren't dramatic changes. There were some changes, but not dramatic in the circumstances. And so it was a hard case to argue, and he did it, I would say, extremely capably, granted how hard that case is to argue.
As Lord Goldsmith said several times today, all he did was confirm that the Iraq War was, in his view, legal. He did not say whether it was right or not. That was the judgment of the man who faces the questions on Friday, Tony Blair.
Well, with us in the studio now is Lance Price, former special advisor to Tony Blair. And in New York is Khan Ross, formerly the UK specialist on Iraq at the United Nations. Khan Ross, from where you sit, this change of mind by Lord Goldsmith after a trip to Washington, does it strike you as plausible?
Well, it's plausible in that he changed his mind after it became clear to the UK that they couldn't get the second resolution through the Security Council, which earlier they thought they had required. So there's a kind of post-facto scrabbling for legal justification in it. But his whole narrative is undermined by two key facts, two key actions by the government itself. First, when they sold 1441 to the Security Council, British diplomats in the Council and in public made clear that it was not a war-authorising resolution, that it was in fact a last chance for inspections and for peace. And secondly, if the British believed that 1441 was in fact sufficient justification, why did they go back to the Security Council for a second authorising resolution?
That is,
because when the Council...
hang on,
I mean, it undermines their own case.
Let's see. Why on earth, if the original resolution was adequate, why go for another one?
It was clear from what Lord Goldsmith said today that there were different interpretations of the legality contained within that original resolution, and that there were a lot of people, many of them in the British government, but also elsewhere around the world, who didn't believe it was sufficient. Therefore, as Lord Goldsmith said in part of his evidence today, the safest course was to reinforce the first resolution with the second resolution and to demonstrate to the world that you were prepared to go that extra mile to try to get the United Nations to confirm it. But there was a problem with
there's basically a gesture of goodwill then.
Well, the problem with the second resolution was, of course, that it handed a veto to any individual member of the Security Council. And that was why, clearly, the Americans weren't comfortable with that, and I suspect that Tony Blair wasn't either.
Khan Ross, you're sitting there in New York saying this is nonsense.
I mean, this is just extraordinary. I'm sorry. I mean, the Blair supporters, the Goldsmith line is now becoming a sort of, honest people disagree over the legal justification. This is just not plausible. If you going to the Security Council for a Security Council resolution is a very, very serious matter. You don't do it to clarify views amongst lawyers in Britain. You do it because you need that authority to go to war. Britain must have taken the view before going to the Security Council that it needed that second resolution. If it had already felt that it had sufficient justification in 1441, why did it go again to the Council? In fact, there's something worse than that, because if you go to the Council and ask for legal authority and don't get it, then you are explicitly not authorised by the Council to use force. You can't then go back and say, well, actually, the earlier resolutions that we had give us sufficient justification when you've gone back to the Council for a second bite of the cherry and been turned down.
Khan Ross, do you find... Well, one of the things that Lord Goldsmith said today was that he had a conversation with Sir Jeremy Greenstock, Britain's ambassador at the UN, which had suggested to him that the French and the Russians saw no need for a second resolution. Does that strike you as plausible?
Well, it's a very odd story, because the French and the Russians didn't want to go to war. And when the second resolution was presented to the Security Council, the French and the Russians made clear that they wouldn't let it pass, mainly because they saw it as seeking authority for war. This was the whole problem with the second resolution. when the British diplomats presented it at the Security Council, they were asked repeatedly by sceptical delegations, is this authority for war? And they were forced to reply, yes, it is. And that's why they didn't get the support in the Council. They didn't get the 9 votes that they would need to get it passed, let alone the assent of the permanent members who had a veto.